Welcome to HP at Church, a podcast about Harry Potter and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they and them.
In this episode, we'll discuss the Palm and/or Passion Sunday and Maundy Thursday. Some churches celebrate Palm Sunday, Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem the week before Easter begins, and others use it as a time to tell the story of the entire week, also known as Jesus' Passion. So we call it Passion Sunday. Occasionally, churches will do a mix of both. After we cover that Sunday, we'll share with you our 2 previous years' recordings covering the readings for Maundy Thursday, since they do not change, though we're tossing in our word from our sponsors for your entertainment in between. If you want to follow along in our blog, it's hpatchurch.wordpress.com, hpatchurch.wordpress.com. And you can find links to the Bible passages we're using and more information on other references we make in this episode.
Also, if you appreciate what we do, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/hpatchurch. Not only do you get access to special content, but you'll also be helping us be more accessible and sustainable as a podcast, which is important to us, since not everybody has a quick quotes quill to meet their access needs.
Also, while both Emily and I are Lutheran, I feel we should point out that when it comes to Patreon, we are non-denominational. We will take all denominations of money. $5 bills, $10 bills, $20 bills, $50, whatever. Just use your imagination.
We'll even take $2 bills.
Yes, those are fun. Our first reading for this episode is the reading for Palm Sunday, often used as a processional reading at the beginning of the service, with everyone walking in carrying palm branches. This year, Palm Sunday falls on the 5th of April. Our reading is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 21, verses 1 through 11. Jesus arrives in Jerusalem on a donkey and a colt, and makes a triumphant entrance.
So one of the themes that I kind of love and don't love about Matthew is this over-the-top precision around fulfillment of prophecy. Matthew does it in a lot of places. This is one of the places in particular where the other gospel writers maybe took the original scripture as on a donkey, comma, a colt, the foal of a donkey. So not just a donkey, but a baby donkey. And instead, Matthew's, the way that Matthew translated it was on a donkey and on a colt together.
On the other hand, this way it doesn't sound like Jesus is into squashing baby animals.
I mean, true, he's not squashing the baby animals, but how's he riding on a donkey and a colt? We'll save that for a little bit later, because I'm going to bring it up again.
Oh, so will I.
Oh, perfect. So this reminded me of Hermione in potions class, particularly in her 6th year, that she is so precise in following the instructions in the book or on the board, depending. But I think Snape put most of them on the board, and then Horace Slughorn put them in, or didn't put them. And then Horace Slughorn just used the books.
Right.
But because she's so precise, she's unwilling to waver from the original instructions, and so actually ends up not being able to do the potion as well as Harry does, because she doesn't have those helps, and she's not willing to take a risk and veer away from that. Just like Matthew's making Jesus ride on 2 animals at once. As we dive into the actual verses for this passage, in verse 3, Jesus tells the disciples that if anyone says anything, to just say, "The Lord needs them," and they'll send whatever it is they're asking for immediately. Which sounds a lot like the Potter needs them, where Harry could probably at some points in these books get whatever he wanted just by Potter needs them, whether it's when he's a Triwizard Tournament champion, trying to be a Triwizard Tournament champion, or in Deathly Hallows. It reminded me actually of when Lupin and Shacklebolt are checking if either is the wrong person once they finally make it to the Burrow in Deathly Hallows. And the way they do it is by saying, what was the last thing that Albus Dumbledore said to both of them together? And it was, Harry is the best hope we have. Trust him. And it feels like that sort of a thing where it's like, trust him.
Yeah.
He needs it. Just do it. Like, and people just magically go along.
I'm going to point out that odds are the twins used that line at some point to get something out of somebody. It might have been Dumbledore. I'm just saying.
That's brilliant. I bet they did.
You know they needed, like, an
They're
ingredient
geniuses.
or something, and yeah. So we reach verse 7, and both Emily and I had pretty strong reactions to verse 7. And Emily, would you like to share the bit with the class that caught our attention from this verse?
Yes, I would, in fact. Matthew describes it and says, "They brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and Jesus sat on them."
Yeah, this sounds awkward to us, too. Is one animal being used as a footstool? I think that's how my childhood Bible with the illustrations illustrated it. Or are they exactly the same height, and Jesus is somehow, like, straddling both at the same time, in which case, way to do the splits, Jesus. Or, I don't know, but this just sounds weird. Imagine Harry trying to ride 2 brooms at the same time. That sounds like an excellent way to fall down.
Right, and I was thinking about it as, like, Jesus is human size. He's not Hagrid. He can't span that much space by himself.
Exactly. And then finally, when I reached verse 10, I bet a lot more people were confused about who Jesus was in Jerusalem back then than there were people who were confused about who the Death Eaters at the World Cup in Book 4 were. Although maybe there were a few more Muggle-born kids who had to ask what the heck was going on, much like Harry had to.
Yeah.
But I do find it interesting that plenty of people in Jerusalem still didn't know who Jesus was.
It's true. Our next set of readings come from our readings for Passion Sunday, which is also April 5th this year. And our first reading is Isaiah chapter 50, verses 4 through 9a. God's servant remains confident in God, whatever trial they face. So one of the themes of this is utter disgrace, right? It's holding out your cheek for someone to pull out your beard, giving your back to have someone strike it. It's just like intended to be the worst of the worst and to make you feel terrible about yourself kind of things. And while in Isaiah there's a willingness to do this, it reminded me of the scene, particularly in the movie in Goblet of Fire, where Voldemort has come back, minus the nose, and the Death Eaters are around, and he's giving his speech about the Death Eaters and all of that stuff, and then at one point, like, acknowledges Cedric lying dead on the ground, and, like, pushes his face with his foot. And maybe it's just my own extreme aversion to feet speaking here, but it just, like, there's something about that just feels degrading.
Yeah. No, that was definitely not a respectful thing that Voldemort was doing.
Yeah, it was bad. As we reach verse 4, we hear that God has given the prophet words, "that I may know how to sustain the weary with a word." And I was thinking about that, and then I was, like, trying to figure out when the, like, great powerful speeches to, like, keep people going during the midst of a struggle were, and there weren't any. Like, Harry Potter, all of the books don't have any great sustaining words or speeches or of encouragement or anything. Like, you would think at least in Deathly Hallows they would, but no, instead it's, these are the facts. Voldemort is here to attack us all. Here's how to get out. Here's how to stay and fight. Here are the groups. Go do your thing.
Team. No. Not
like,
really
not
any
even
pep
a go
talks.
team.
No. Yeah, no, you're right. I was thinking about this, and there are moments that sustain you as the reader that are kind of, not exactly like pep talks, but like I noticed in the darker moments of the books, Ms. Rowling was pretty good about throwing in moments of humor here and there. My two favorite examples being when the twins left Hogwarts, which was pretty spectacular and a really bright moment in a fairly dark book. And then my second favorite is in Deathly Hallows when Ron and Hermione finally get their selves together. And Harry, after a few moments of being very patient, responds to their apparently endless kiss with, "There's a war on." And I just lost it at that point. That was fantastic. And also sounds like exactly the thing that Daniel Radcliffe would say. They picked the perfect actor for that. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Sustaining the weary reader who isn't actually weary, just like
yes,
in the depths of it. But poor characters, no sustenance.
Yeah, and then I got to the second half of verse 4, and that reads, "Morning by morning God wakens my ear to listen as those who are taught." And that makes me think that the best teachers are those who remain willing to learn, as we do see in the Harry Potter series. Lupin, for example, seems very willing to learn throughout his time at Hogwarts, but unfortunately Lockhart does not seem to learn much, and then, of course, after a little while, he has the ability to learn removed from him, because he can't remember anything. Oops.
Wonder whose fault that is.
Yeah. And then when we get to verses 6 and 7, which are about the servant being humble and being willing to put up with a lot of mistreatment, these verses remind me of Hagrid. He will put up with quite a bit of being mistreated by a variety of people, but the thing is, he has Dumbledore's approval, and that's all he needs, much like the servant has God's approval, and that's all the servant needs.
I mean, kind of. He needs more approval than that. Like, he is pretty upset when that thing comes out about him being a half-giant.
Well, yes.
But, like, the day-to-day, yeah.
Yeah, the day-to-day kind of thing, he's good.
Yeah.
He can put up with all kinds, especially, like, with the animals and the way that they keep trying to kill him, and yeah.
You know, yeah. And then in verse 8, the prophet says, "The one who vindicates me is near. Who will contend with me? Let us stand up together. Who are my adversaries? Let them confront me." It's just this, like, all right, if we're going to do this, let's do this. If you're my adversary, let's have it out. If you're with me, let's get together. Kind of the, like, why put it off any longer attitude.
Yeah.
Which is, like, the exact opposite of Voldemort's tactics in Deathly Hallows. Voldemort's like, "I'm here and I'm ready. You have an hour." Or, like, after the fighting, then it's like, okay, now we're gonna stop, and now you have another hour, and it's like, okay, just, like, get it over with.
Does Voldemort need
but also, like,
Is he that
gives
British?
him time to, like, increase fear and anxiety, and really he wants to find Harry, so there's that. But yeah.
Our next reading is from Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11. The earliest Christian hymn we have record of. These verses describe Christ's willingness to join with humanity rather than lord divinity over us, even when it meant death on the cross.
So one of the themes in this passage for me is solidarity, that Jesus could have just gone the, like, I'm better than everyone route. And instead, Jesus intentionally, like, takes on human form and joins us, joins in solidarity with us. And so then I was thinking about, I don't think solidarity happens all that much in the Harry Potter books, honestly, which is not surprising given that they're written by J.K. Rowling, who is a TERF and doesn't understand things like that. But there was, like, the point that you alluded to earlier of when Ron finally starts thinking about house elves differently. In Deathly Hallows, he's like, oh no, the house elves. And Harry is like, oh, you want to go get them to fight for us? And Ron's like, no, we got to get them out of here. And that's the point where Hermione then, like, kisses him. But it's this moment for him where he finally gets that house elves are living beings.
Right.
And have a right to be alive and not just be tools that he can use to do his bidding. And that's not the same as solidarity, but I think for him, it's his first step towards solidarity.
Yeah, and that kind of sounds like Ron believes that, maybe employers should allow their employees to leave life-threatening situations. Funny how that works.
Or give them sick leave.
Yes.
So they don't spread COVID-19.
Or other viruses. I'm in favor of not spreading other viruses, or indeed bacterial infections.
I'm in favor of unlimited sick days, because then everyone who needs them will take them, and those who don't need them won't take them. They've actually done studies. None of this, like, limited sick days thing.
No.
Ugh, capitalism.
In verse 5, I would like to point out that having the same mind as Jesus is kind of what you go for as a Christian, although, most of us fail miserably, continually, or at least for brief bits here and there. But that does not mean that you are supposed to imperio yourself to have the same mind as Jesus, or ask Jesus to imperio you. That is not how this works. That is why we can't have nice things. Because then you might as well just not have a mind in the first place. It is not the same thing.
I don't think I would have thought of imperioing myself to be like Jesus.
I don't know that would actually work. Like, can you imperio yourself in order to do something if you know what you want to do, but you don't think that you'll be able to do it? Like, if you had practiced a piano piece, but you kept getting a couple of particular keys wrong, just because sometimes that happens, could you imperio yourself to play it perfectly?
I don't think you can.
If, like,
I don't think you
theoretically
can imperio yourself. Because your mind has to be clear to focus on what you want it to do,
Right.
and imperio, by very nature of it, fogs your mind.
That's probably fair, yes. But please don't ask Jesus to imperio you either. That's going to lead to really awkward theological conversations that even Nicodemus would get tired of. So
Yeah, kind of not what he's about.
No.
As we continue on verse 8, we hear that Jesus humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death. And it made me wonder if how Harry thought about his first death in Deathly Hallows, and if he thought about it as obedience to Dumbledore, or if he was just following the only plan anybody could think of that might work, right? If it was just, as they say in an episode of Joan of Arcadia, a failure of imagination to think of a different way to make it work.
honestly, I kind of thought it was more along the lines of what you were talking about earlier, the can we just get this over with thing instead.
Oh, I don't have time to, come up with a new plan.
Well, by that point, it's like 4 o'clock
things.
in the morning, right? So how exhausted
true.
must he be? And can we just finish this already? Come on. I want to get some sleep.
That's fair. In verse 10, part of the hymn is, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bend, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, which is pretty much exactly what Voldemort wants from folks, plus some other things, except Voldemort only is willing to consider doing it by force. And this hymn is talking about every knee bending towards Jesus in a, love and adoration kind of way, not in a, I'm terrified that you're going to kill me kind of way.
Yeah.
Slight difference.
And then in verse 11, on a similar note to my previous comment, when it comes to every tongue confessing that Jesus is Lord, the idea is that the people who those tongues belong to will announce that Jesus is Lord of their own free will, and not because their tongues have been charmed to do so. And certainly their tongues have not been cut out and, charmed to do so. That would be horrifically awkward and also a really terrifying scene. I have heard every possible joke about this verse. Let me put it that way. So, yes, let's point out that this is also of pure free will. And, I hadn't really thought about it before, but you're right. Voldemort does insist on having that kind of subjugation by force. He doesn't go up to people and just say, hey, if you want to, you can follow me.
Yeah.
And then threaten them afterwards. It's just, let's start with the threats, and yeah.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that in this passage, both of us, 3 out of 4 of our comments were about, forcing people to do things versus people doing them willingly or wanting them.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
We're kind of big on consent.
It's a cool thing.
Mm-hmm.
So for our Passion Sunday Gospel, which is our next reading, we're doing just the beginning of the text. The text itself is 2 chapters long, if you want to do the whole Passion story in the Gospel of Matthew. The part that we're suggesting, there are some congregations who do it this way, where they celebrate Palm Sunday and use the Palm Sunday Gospel that we read at the beginning of this episode as the focus for preaching, and then at the end of the service, as the sending, they will begin the Passion. So read the beginning of the Gospel Passion as a way of leading people into Holy Week, so that folks who aren't going to make it to Maundy Thursday or Good Friday still get a sense of the depth and the kind of weight of the week and the importance of the week, and to lead people into thinking and moving towards Maundy Thursday and then Good Friday before coming back on Sunday for Easter.
I think I also read somewhere that Passion Sunday was actually a tradition of the ancient church as well, and it's not like it's new, and it was a little less common, but the idea was it was to teach new Christians. So that way they get the full story right up front, and then they hear the continuing bits of the story as the week goes. So I thought that was interesting.
Interesting.
I don't remember where I read that, though. But at least a couple of colleagues were definitely very insistent that the whole Passion versus Palm Sunday thing was not new.
I had always heard that it was a pretty new thing, so that's fascinating to me, too. Mm-hmm. So, as we dive into the gospel that we're reading, we're doing Matthew 26, verses 14 through 25. Judas's betrayal of Jesus bookends the preparations for the Passover meal that Jesus and the disciples will share before the crucifixion. So, a theme that is maybe obvious is preparation. Jesus' disciples are preparing for the Passover, and the other main preparation that I think about is preparation for a different kind of Last Supper, which is the wedding in Deathly Hallows, Bill and Fleur's wedding, where there are so many preparations that have to be made for this big event that does actually end up being the Last Supper.
Yeah.
I mean, Percy doesn't come, but aside from that, like, it's the last time that all of the Weasleys are together, because the next time, Fred, like, the next time we see all of them is the Battle of Hogwarts, where Fred dies. And so it's a different kind of Last Supper, but it's also this, like, great preparation for this great feast that ends up being an ending of sorts.
Yeah. In verse 15, we see Judas sell Jesus' life for 30 pieces of silver. And the only comparison I can come up with in the Harry Potter books, much as I don't actually like to use it, is that Judas's price was 30 pieces of silver. Xenophilius's price was the life of his daughter. Yes, they're different situations, but also not really.
I mean, they are and they aren't, right? There's definitely a different weightiness to it.
Yeah.
That the life of your daughter makes sense. And even Harry.
Yeah, no, it's not like
that,
I don't
right?
get it.
Like, whatever.
But also, it's your daughter versus the lives of 3 other people, plus probably more.
Yeah.
And 30 pieces of silver versus 1 life.
Yeah. I do think it is important to point out, though, there is a difference in that Judas, like, goes and seeks out.
Yes.
And says, like, what'll you give me for delivering Jesus? And Xenophilius has been a Harry supporter and gets
blackmailed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there are differences, but yeah.
Also, Judas really should have known better. If he'd gone comparison price shopping, he really probably could have gotten a better deal. I'm just saying.
He definitely could have, because the Romans did not like Jesus at all.
Yeah.
And they end up all going in on it together, and it's a Roman form of execution. But yeah. Well, and then in verse 18, Jesus instructs the disciples to find a certain man. Very few descriptions. Like, how are you supposed to find this certain man? It's like when Harry was trying to figure out who Grindelwald was from the memories and flashes into Voldemort's mind. Not very helpful. All he has is a, like, youthful face about to disappear with the Elder Wand.
Yeah.
Not helpful. Certain man. Young face.
I always figured that meant that Jesus described the guy, and then, while writing the Gospel, Matthew didn't remember the description.
It's possible. I hope so, because otherwise that would not be a...
Assuming that the certain man didn't have a giant flashing neon sign over his head saying, Jesus wants you to talk to me.
So, right, like, it's me. Pick me.
Certain man.
That would be hilarious.
And, Aramaic, of course.
Of course. Well, and I can imagine, like, video game-wise, where they have, like, things and they, like, who everybody
character
is.
labeling, yeah.
Yeah.
And then in verse 21, one of the parts of this story that I've kind of always wondered about is why Jesus announces that he's going to be betrayed at this point. It doesn't actually seem to help anything. It just makes everybody nervous and weird, and presumably judgy of each other. I'm trying to imagine what would have happened if Dumbledore or Trelawney had had a vision of Snape becoming a Death Eater before he did or as he did, and then told him about it. Like, would it have made a difference in Snape's life? I mean, at that point, he was all about betraying everything for Voldemort anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do think it makes a difference for Jesus in the, like, storytelling sense that, like, it proves, like, he knew what was going to happen. He wasn't,
Right.
like, he wasn't caught unaware, but...
But what did that mean for the other 11 disciples? Like, it feels like the ultimate Midwestern passive-aggressive power move. Like poor Philip is sitting at that table and he has been running around talking to certain men all day and would just really like to have dinner already. And then Jesus throws that bombshell out there, and what's he supposed to do now? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Speaking of betrayal, I also noticed this verse. I think while you were focusing on, like, why is Jesus even saying that, the thing that struck me was that then all of the disciples were like, well, is it me? Is it you? Who is it? And so thinking about when they get Harry out of Privet Drive at the beginning of Deathly Hallows, and clearly someone has betrayed their secret of leaving at that point, but nobody knows who. And so everybody in the order knows, and then many of them say, someone has betrayed us. And then it's like figuring out who betrayed them, which they actually, I think, never do unless Mundungus Fletcher somehow gets to the point where he can remember it, but I don't think he does. And so it's just a lot of, like, how do I know that you're really who you say you are? Kind of, are you the one that betrayed us? Are you the one that betrayed us? Are you the one that betrayed us?
Yeah.
And now we will move on to Maundy Thursday. So on Maundy Thursday, Jesus and his disciples gather for their Last Supper together before his death. He washes their feet, and then they have the first celebration of Holy Communion. We will be reading the Gospel of John for this because that's the signed text, but depending on which Gospel account you follow, this Last Supper with Jesus will be either the night before Passover or the night of Passover. In the Gospel of John, it's the night before Passover so that Jesus' whole ordeal with suffering and death on the cross can connect to Jesus being the sacrificial lamb.
Something else we want to talk about before we get going with the passages from Maundy Thursday, when we discuss this day on the church calendar, and particularly for those of us who are Lutheran, and certainly heavily for those of us like me who are Lutherans with German heritage. In order to be good neighbors to the Jewish people, we have to be very careful about how we talk about the Jewish people and their traditions. We are not Jewish. I am not Jewish. You might be. But those of us who aren't Jewish, we need to be careful about how we talk about these things. Passover is Jewish, not Christian. We don't want to co-opt Passover for our own use. When we celebrate Maundy Thursday, we celebrate Maundy Thursday. We celebrate the washing of the feet and the First Communion. We are not celebrating Passover. This comes up when churches discuss whether to have a special meal on Maundy Thursday as a remembrance of the Last Supper, and I think there is a difference between celebrating the Last Supper as the Last Supper and trying to celebrate Passover as though one is Jewish when you're not.
Yep. There is such a thing as an agape meal, and it is a great resource for Christians for Maundy Thursday if you want to have a shared meal. Our first reading for Maundy Thursday is Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 through 14, where God instructs the Israelites to prepare for the first Passover in Egypt, which will mark the beginning of the year for them in the future. So the first thing that came to mind for me was the feast at the beginning of the school year, which is an obvious option, except that the Passover is, while it marks the beginning, it is a very hurried meal. And so it actually fits better with Harry, Ron, and Hermione when they land Hogsmeade in Book 7, right before heading into Hogwarts. And they end up in the Hog's Head with Aberforth Dumbledore, and Ron makes a comment and is hungry, and so Aberforth brings out bread and cheese and mead, and the trio eat a hasty meal before they head to Hogwarts, where the Great Battle of Hogwarts will ensue and the slaughter will begin. On a side note, I thought that adding cheese into communion would be a brilliant idea. I love cheese.
I would also say Ron, when he left Harry and Hermione, I got the feeling he was leaving not because he couldn't take the work and the stress itself of what they were doing. It was because he had just never struggled with hunger before. He grew up in the house of Molly Weasley, who will feed you if you look at her twice. And so hunger was new to him. And when you add that to all the other stuff they were already going through, that was just one straw too many on the camel's back. I think there's a place for us to talk about hunger when it comes to Maundy Thursday and the Last Supper and being fed by Christ, by Christ's body and blood. And I think you could tie that into food insecurity in the world and in America, and how much hunger affects your ability to live your daily life and also to be a nice person. I'm one of those people. I know that many people do fasting or 36-hour fast for various reasons. I can't. I have had to say to people that no, this is not a spiritual practice that I am capable of doing, not because it affects me physically and medically, although it does. When my blood sugar crashes, I am just out like a light. I have a certain level of self-control when I am not hungry, but when I am hungry, like truly hungry, like not having eaten for 36 hours hungry, I apparently turn into an entirely different person, just like mean and snippy. So I have had to say that fasting is just not for me. I guess I identify with Ron to an extent in this, because hunger is a trial, and it's something that some people can deal with, some people can't, and I don't think it's a moral judgment on Ron that he didn't have it in him to deal with that at that time. I don't think it makes him a bad person, because it really does affect people in a really extensive way.
Yeah, I call it being hangry.
Yes.
Which I did not coin, but other people did. I also get very hangry. And I think there's this propensity to make Ron's struggle with hunger be a moral thing. I think we do that all the time with food and with eating.
And being healthy means not eating 2,000 calories a day, when in fact that is the recommended amount of calories for any adult person, pretty much.
And that we each have different amounts to which something is healthy or not healthy for us, right? That we can't look at a person's physical appearance and say that's healthy or that's not healthy, because we don't know if it's actually healthy for them. We don't know what genetics are behind how they look. We don't know if there's eating disorders or disordered eating or the problematic stuff with diet culture, right? But we tend to moralize that and say, if you don't look this particular way, or if you don't eat these particular things, there's something wrong with you. And while there are ethics in what we choose to eat, as far as human treatment of workers and treatment of animals is concerned, the morals of eating are really unfair to a lot of people.
The idea that there is good food and bad food, and it's not about the bad food being the result of people being treated badly, but rather, will it make you fat? Mm-hmm. I was reading a really interesting post on Tumblr the other day, but it was a woman telling a story of going to a new doctor, and she is overweight, and she has always been overweight throughout her life. When she went to this doctor, she had in her medical file information about her eating disorder. She didn't know if the doctor had read it yet, and almost immediately she found out that the doctor hadn't. Because the thing is, her eating disorder was not binging. Her eating disorder was actually not eating enough. It's just that her body did not allow her to lose huge amounts of weight. The doctor assumed, when she brought up her eating disorder, that she needed to avoid binging too much. And really what she needed to avoid was dieting, was restricting her food, because the minute she started to do that, she fell back into anorexia, basically, if I remember right. And she started putting all sorts of new rules on herself. And she had to remind the doctor 2 or 3 times during the conversation that, no, this is hurtful to me, during that conversation. And that was certainly not the only time she'd had that conversation. Every time she had to explain to someone that she had an eating disorder, it took her a few times to get it through their heads that that was not her direction. And she needed to be careful the other way. The first thing that comes to mind, the obvious option is not always the one to go with, and we have to be careful when it comes to food. I believe that this is something that can and should be addressed in preaching today, because it is such a pernicious issue in our communities. And I think Maundy Thursday, and also certainly the day of the feeding of the 5,000, and any time that food comes up in the Bible, it's something that we can at least touch on for a moment.
Which I'm sure we will talk about a lot when we get to year C and Luke, because Jesus eats all the time in Luke.
Yes, and then of course there's the 6 straight weeks of John talking about Jesus being the bread of life, which is every preacher's favorite season. So we mentioned the importance of not co-opting Passover and pretending that we're Jewish when we're not. And it does seem like every Maundy Thursday that comes around, my clergy colleagues and I have the conversation about, if you do a special meal, be very careful about how you phrase it, and avoiding, the technical term for it is supersessionalism, which means that you're saying that Christians have replaced the Jewish people in the special place of God's chosen, which is not true. The Jewish people are still here. All of their covenants with God are still running. And we have to especially be careful about that as Lutherans, because Lutherans do have that German connection.
And the connection of Martin Luther's actual anti-Semitic words.
Yes, he said some truly horrifying things. We do have to be especially careful about anti-Semitism and the appearance of it because of our history, even if it wasn't our own families, even if it wasn't people that we're actually related to. It was people who looked like us. It was people who we have things in common with. And when people look at German Lutherans, especially when Jewish people probably look at German Lutherans, especially when other groups that were attacked by the Nazis look at German Lutherans, whether it's queer people or the Romani or Catholics or anybody. When they look at us, of course there's going to be that connection in the back of their minds. There's no stopping that. It reminds me about how J.K. Rowling's support of keeping Johnny Depp in the movies, the new movies that are coming out now, is ruining so much of the credit that she had built up with children who were abused and who turned to her books for comfort and strength.
Yeah, I think that's something that we've been discovering not only with Johnny Depp, but also with Native peoples in what we know as North America, but they know primarily as Turtle Island, that in J.K. Rowling's writings about Ilvermorny, the magical school here on this continent, she didn't do all of the research she could have, and when she's been criticized about her treatment of Indigenous peoples here, she has dismissed it. She has blocked people who are calling her out on Twitter. And it is really it's hard to be told that you're wrong or you're doing something harmful. And yet part of what Christ calls us to is to be honest about that, right? That a lot of what happens in this Holy Week is about dishonesty. It's about going behind somebody's back, about not being upfront with things, about not being able to actually face things that are happening. And so when we try to hide all of the ways that we have harmed others, we lose our own credibility as well.
As much as the phrase political correctness has come under fire, when we're being careful about what words we choose, we're not doing it to be perfect in the eyes of others. We're doing it to avoid hurting other people. And the line about sticks and stones isn't true. I mean, I was bullied as a kid.
Mm-hmm. Me too.
Yeah. And it's not the words themselves that hurt. It's the knowledge of what resides in that person's head about you that hurts.
Mm-hmm. When what you're saying and what you're doing shows that you do not value me or people that I care about or other people that I don't even know, that's when we have a problem. Yep.
When we talk about the Jewish people using blood as a sign on the doorposts at Passover, I think this also brings us back to the importance of family blood connection in the Harry Potter books. And I think that has a connection not only to Harry and his mother's blood protecting him, and Petunia and and Dudley being in their presence protects him, but also to the line between pureblood and muggleborn, and how blood connections, and I'm talking about it in that term because we're not including the family connections of marriage or adoption in this. But those connections are so vitally important to how magic is passed on in Harry Potter, and the blood on the doorposts as the sign that these people are the beloved children of God, the Israelites. I believe that there is a connection there about how God's protection is passed on. And yet we also find that God chooses people outside of that too. The example that comes immediately to mind is the servant Eliezer, who was adopted by Abraham long before Isaac was born, as his heir if he did not have children. And God plucks people out of nowhere so often. Several of them happen to be women, Ruth and Rahab in the city of Jericho, and all sorts of others.
Yep, and if we look at in Matthew and Luke, in both Matthew and Luke, there are accounts of Jesus' ancestry, and that is a great place to look at. You know, Ruth is an ancestor of David, who is Jesus' ancestor. Rahab shows up. Tamar shows up. Each of the women who show up in that particularly have some important story about them.
Ruth was a Moabite, and there's passages in the Bible about how evil the Moabites are, and yet Ruth winds up being an ancestor of Jesus.
Yep.
I do enjoy seeing that progression in the Bible from exclusion to inclusion. And it's not just Old Testament versus New Testament, because there's change within the Old Testament as well. It does seem to be a continuing movement as God changes the way that God treats different types of people. And now we come to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 through 26, in which we hear the words of the institution of communion, the Last Supper, which proclaims Christ's death until Christ comes again.
This got me thinking about how we proclaim death, right? So if we think about the Deathly Hallows and the Death Eaters, and then we think about our own Muggle world and all of the anti-aging stuff that we have, the ways that we try, right, with makeup, with plastic surgery, with all of these things, we try to avoid death. We try to put it away. We don't even name death when somebody dies, right? We say that they passed away, that they're sleeping, that they're in the beyond. Well, maybe not in the beyond. That's Trelawney.
Although I do want to have a momentary shout out to say, please don't use the language about sleep about people who are dead, especially not around small children. Their parents will not thank you for it that evening, and they don't need the nightmares.
We do fear death and we avoid death, but really one of the gifts of communion is to face death and to name the reality of death, also knowing that it is not the end, it is not the final word. And that's particularly for Lutherans, right? We're about telling the truth about things. That's part of the theology of the cross, is to call a thing what it is and to call death, death. And by naming that, we are more able to face it. And I think the Death Eaters are trying to avoid it. The Deathly Hallows are more complicated, but...
We acknowledge that, yes, we will die, but we also acknowledge that that's not the end. That's Ash Wednesday for you. That's Good Friday for you. There's a lovely t-shirt that I have from Welcome to Night Vale, which says, "Death is only the end of the story if you think the story is about you." And it's such a lovely Lutheran sentiment, and I know they didn't mean it that way, but I don't care. But this has also come up for me recently in conversations with fellow clergy. What if you're up there leading worship one Sunday and somebody walks in with a gun? What do you do? Some of the conversation was about, well, at that point I grab my family and I run like the Dickens, right? But as I think as the conversation has matured, is the way I would want to put it, we've also realized that rescuing your own personal family isn't the role of the pastor in that situation. If you're up there leading worship in that moment, you are not focusing on the Greeks' idea of brotherly love. Instead, you are focusing on the Greeks' idea of agape, of perfect, altruistic, God's love. And that means that your role in that moment is not to protect the people you care about the most personally. Instead, your role is to think about the congregation, to think about everyone who is there. It likely means acknowledging the fact that if you're the one up front leading worship, you're the most noticeable person in the room, and you are likely to be one of the first targets.
There are kind of two things that these conversations bring up for me. One, as you were talking about, I couldn't help but think of Archbishop Oscar Romero in El Salvador, right, who literally was leading worship, was presiding at Holy Communion, and watched a car drive by, right? The doors were open because it was in April. The doors were open, so he could see right out of the doors. I actually have been to that chapel, right? So you can stand behind the altar and you can see right out the doors, and you know that he watched a car drive slowly by, turn around, come back, roll down the window, and shoot him in the middle of presiding at communion. And he could have ducked, he could have ran for cover, but instead he stayed there. And he even talked about it because he had been getting death threats, and he knew right? He talked about, if you kill me, I might die, but I will rise again in the people. And that's how we think about martyrs a lot of the time. And right, it definitely connects with Jesus in our story during this Holy Week.
Ultimately speaking, as Christians, we acknowledge that there are worse things that can happen to a person than death.
Mm-hmm. And I think part of it, too, is somebody recently posted this, and it really resonated with me, that even as we like to deny death in our culture, we also are getting to the point where we're obsessing over it in unhealthy ways, right?
I think in part because we're so separated from it, most of the population.
Mm-hmm.
Most people, the closest connection they have with death is a loved one dies and they go to the funeral, and that's it. The likelihood of being at someone's deathbed more than a few times in your life, if you're not clergy or in the medical profession, is pretty low.
But what this person was saying that resonated with me was that we're obsessing so much over fear of death. Children in schools are doing lockdown drills and having to figure out what they would do if this happened, if that happened. Pastors and leaders of congregations are being pressured to figure out a plan to tighten security. And that I think is an unhealthy fear of death. It is not proclaiming death. It is being afraid of death and letting it actually control your life and your actions. And that's not what we're called to. Children shouldn't have to do lockdown drills. They shouldn't have to be afraid of dying. Congregations shouldn't have to be afraid of dying in worship. And this goes not just for Christians, right? But I think the fear is even more drastic for Muslims and Jewish people who have these legitimate fears because they've been getting threats, particularly over the last several years. But that what we do when we come together, we shouldn't be tightening security. Our congregations and our places of worship are supposed to be a place where people are welcome to come in and to experience the holy together.
A place of sanctuary.
Yes.
And allowing that place to become a place where we are constantly obsessed with fear, it turns it from sanctuary into something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the other part of this passage, the main part of this passage, are what we as pastors call the words of institution. It is the words that we attribute to Jesus enacting the first Holy Communion. For Lutherans, we believe in a fancy word called consubstantiation, that when we participate in communion, it's not just a symbol, but it is an enactment, that Christ is truly present with us in that. And I was trying to think of anything that would really be comparable in the wizarding world, like a holiday or a memorial created after the Battle of Hogwarts, and I was having trouble thinking of something.
I couldn't come up with a comparison to the Last Supper from the books, but I did remember a classic fanfiction story that had a very strong parallel for me. Now, this story is called Transfigurations. The author's name is Resonant. You can find it on the Archive of Our Own, or the AO3, as it's commonly called, archiveofourown.org.
And we'll include a link on our blog.
I do want to warn you, this story, not only is it quite long and also extremely well written, I should also tell you that it's adult rated. There is a romance between Harry and Draco in this story, and there are some explicit sex scenes. Ultimately speaking, it's a very plotty story. It's about a wonderful exploration of what they call calligromancy might look like, and the idea of how different kinds of magic might work, the ideas of how American magic might be different from European magic. This story was also written before Book 5, so you should keep that in mind if you go looking for it. But this story has Draco and Harry and Hermione and Ron and so on as teachers at Hogwarts. And they are trying to undo Death Eater spells at the school after the war is over, after they've won the war. And in order to do that, they have to create a group of people who are willing to donate their own power to the spell to find these curses left by the Death Eaters. Harry is asked to create this group. They have to be a named group in order for the magic to work, because the spell has to refer to the name of the group of people who are donating their power to the spell to find the curses. And they assume, of course, that Harry will do it because, Harry's the hero. Harry does everything. And Harry cannot come up with a way to do something that will create this group. And so Draco, in a huff, grabs the moment from him and grabs a bottle of port, of all things. This is in chapter 11, in the 4th section with the page breaks. And he creates a little ceremony where he gets a person's full name. You learn the middle names of a lot of characters. Of course, they're not the middle names that J.K. Rowling gave them, but it's fun anyway. They formally are asked for their consent to join this group to give their power to the spell to find the curses. And they do give their consent, and he declares them a member of this group, and then they take a sip of port, which is fortified wine. It's this lovely ceremony that he creates, and that ceremony winds up being repeated several times throughout the story. And it reminds me so deeply of the idea of church, because while we don't, in the Lutheran tradition, many of us are baptized as infants, and we don't necessarily personally affirm or choose to give our consent to being part of the church. We do that instead at confirmation, when we're a little older and we're able to more fully understand the idea of what the church is, and then we consent to being part of the church. We confirm that we're willing to do that. And it's a lovely little parallel to that, and to the idea that communion itself is a chance for Christians not only to worship, but also when you take communion, you're confirming your faith. You're affirming that, yes, I do believe that Jesus Christ died for me, and this is his body and blood, and I am given forgiveness of sins to be this. Every time you take communion, it's a confirmation of faith. It's like when I talk to my friends who aren't Christian who will be attending a worship service at a church for some reason. I explain that there are several things in the service that they may be comfortable doing, like singing some of the hymns. They might be okay with doing that if they don't believe in God, or being respectful during the prayer times and just being quiet. Or many churches, when the gospel is read, people stand up in acknowledgement and sort of to honor the gospel. And there are plenty of people who are not Christian who are perfectly happy to stand for the gospel, because it's not that they're showing respect for the gospel as a Christian, but they are showing respect for these other people's religion. And that's perfectly valid. But one of the things that I do not suggest that people do, if they are not Christian, when they go to another worship service, is that I would not suggest you take communion. It's not that you're not welcome. It's just that taking communion is a statement of faith. And if you don't have that faith, I don't want you to betray your own ideals. And so while you may be comfortable asking for a blessing from the pastor instead, which most churches will offer, I don't suggest that you take communion, because communion is a confirmation of faith in the same way. I would also say that if you're going to use this example from this story in a sermon, you would certainly want to have a very specific knowledge of your congregation, and certainly LGBT friendly, and I don't know how you'd explain to them that this is not a G-rated story, but that's just in terms of if you're using it in a sermon. If you're just reading Harry Potter stuff and connecting it to church in your own personal devotional life, go for it.
Yeah, I think communion is definitely something where I always seek to make sure people know that they are welcome to come to communion if they would like to, and that there are other ways to be respectful of that time if they do not want to come to communion. But I had a brainwave for a connection to communion from the Harry Potter books themselves, and it is polyjuice potion. Oh my gosh. Right? Especially in book 7 when the whole crew is at the Dursleys' house getting ready for Harry to head ultimately to the burrow, and they literally consume part of Harry and become Harry. And one of the ways that we also think about communion is, right, the word Christian is the diminutive of Christ. So it's like little Christs, right? We receive Christ's body and blood in the bread and wine or juice, and we become little Christs in the world. And so when in book 7, when they drink the polyjuice potion that contains Harry's hair, each of those 6 other characters become Harry's in appearance and in sound and all of those things. And so, I don't know, it's just fascinating to think about communion as the ultimate permanent polyjuice potion for Jesus.
When we take communion, we are communing with Christ, we are communing with one another, we all become one, and that includes becoming one with Christ.
Mm-hmm.
In many Swedish churches, traditionally, the altar rail, instead of being rectangular or trapezoidal or something like that, or just a straight line, it was made as a semicircle, half a circle. And then on the other side of the back wall of the church where the altar is, would very often, traditionally, be the cemetery for the church. And in the cemetery, as the other half of that circle, was also a stone altar rail outside in the cemetery. And no one would be buried inside it, but it was a physical reminder that when we take communion, we are not only at one with Christ, at one with our fellow Christians who are at the rail with us, at one with all the other Christians who are taking communion in the world, but we're still as one with those who have died and gone before us.
Surrounded by the great cloud of witnesses.
And I understand why people don't like the idea of the altar rail because they think it looks like a fence, but I so deeply connected to that image as a child of the circle of communion and how it goes all the way around, and it includes those who have gone before us. As an imaginative child, I would also add the Christians who have yet to come, the Christians we haven't met yet.
That's beautiful.
I love that image so dearly. I can never really argue with the idea of an altar rail. I don't care what shape it is, because every time I see an altar rail, that's what I think of. I think there's a parallel there for the Harry Potter books, too, because, of course, Harry knows he is so deeply connected to those who have died, because every time he fights with Voldemort, he sees them.
And Dementors, yeah.
Yeah, that too. Something in the Harry Potter books that you could compare to what we call the Eucharistic prayer or the words of institution, where we repeat Jesus' words, this is my body, this is my blood. The prayer, for Lutherans, is what changes it from just having a snack in the middle of church to having communion, right? Because the words of the Eucharistic prayer, it's not that they describe something, it's not that they communicate an idea, but these words enact. Those words are what changes the bread and the wine into the presence of Christ. Christ is truly with us, really and honestly, not just that we're remembering Christ, but that Christ is with us literally at that moment. The Eucharistic prayer is not a spell. Holy Communion is not magic. I don't want people to make that connection. We're not going there. But the idea of words that enact, words that do something, it's not just that they're describing something, but the words themselves, when you say it, it does something. that very much reminds me of a spell, because spells do things, and that there is a grammar concept for words that enact, but all my Googling couldn't find it, so I'm afraid I don't have the technical term for you.
Right, when God says, "Let there be light" in Genesis chapter 1, and light becomes, the words of God enacted. And we even talk about Jesus, particularly in the Gospel of John, as the Word of God.
And the light of God is coming into the world.
Yep. It also reminded me of Carry On by Rainbow Rowell, which is a book. Many of us believe it is a Harry Potter fan fiction. It's a fantastic one, but the way spells work in Carry On is actually that it's the words that give them power and meaning. And so it's that's a great way, I think, of making the way magic and spells work in Harry Potter even more explicit, when it's literally, these are the words, and the way we say them and what we say enact the spell in a more explicit way. Our gospel reading for Maundy Thursday is John chapter 13, verses 1 through 17, and verse 31b to 35. So in John 13, Jesus washes his disciples' feet, the duty of a slave, and commands them to love as he has loved them.
I would like to take a moment to point out, I'm fairly certain that the section in the middle there of John 13 that we skip in the lectionary is the part where Judas leaves.
It is, in fact, the part where Judas leaves. I wrote a paper on this once upon a time for seminary. And if you are doing the daily readings for all of Holy Week, so there are some readings that are assigned for Holy Monday, Holy Tuesday, Holy Wednesday, it is actually the reading on Wednesday.
But we're not including it in our discussion because technically it's not part of the lectionary, and our podcast episodes are probably long enough as it is.
Yes, and we talk about Judas earlier and later.
Right.
So one of the things that this really brought up for me was in book 7 when Harry buries Dobby. And it's very much a Muggle burial of Dobby. And I wonder if it causes a similar shock as Jesus washing the disciples' feet, right? So there's obvious difference in that Dobby is dead and Jesus is going to die. Griphook, the goblin, even later says that part of why he decided to trust Harry was because he saw from the window that Harry was burying Dobby without magic, that he was digging the grave himself, and that he was filling it back in, that he was writing on this stone with his wand, but writing with his own hand in a way that wasn't necessarily as pretty or beautiful as Hermione could have done it, but that it was meaningful because of that.
What is made by hand is made with love, and that's why so many parents have elbow macaroni artwork on their refrigerators.
Yeah. The other part of this is that Jesus calls attention to what was the lowliest work, right? Washing feet was the work of the slaves and the servants. And Voldemort consistently throughout the books discounts and ignores the lowliest work. So he doesn't count the magic of house elves or underage wizards when it comes to crossing in the boat to get to the Horcrux in book 6. But then also Sirius does that with respect to Kreacher. He doesn't count all that Kreacher knows, and in turn, Kreacher betrays him and goes and tells Bellatrix and Narcissa about Harry's relationship with Sirius and how important they are to each other, which leads to his death.
Speaking of ignoring the lowliest work, Voldemort ignored anyone who wasn't powerful. Voldemort wasn't interested in the lowliest work. And that backfires so easily, because if you ignore, the oldest version of that story that I know is, always be nice to your waitress, because she's the one who controls what goes in your food. Or at least that's the earliest version of that story that I was taught as a small child. Be nice to the waitress, and this is why. You did point out we do see an example of that in the Harry Potter books.
Mm-hmm. So you see it with the house elves most clearly, right? And then Harry even has Kreacher and Dobby spy for the trio, even as Kreacher also spies on Sirius. After the jump where Judas leaves, we hear Jesus say, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. And this, in so many different ways, sums up the books as well. Love is the thing that triumphs over everything else. It is the power that lasts. It is what sets Harry and Hermione and Ron and Dumbledore's army and the Order of the Phoenix and all who resist Voldemort apart.
I would say that this is the center of who Voldemort is in a negative way. This is the difference between good and evil. Voldemort would never, ever wash someone else's feet. He would never be subject to another person. He would never humiliate himself for another person's for the love of another person. For him, it's all about power. It's all about never being subject or lesser than anybody else, even if he has to sacrifice his nose to do it. If the movies gave us one worthwhile thing, it was that face, right? At the start, his goal is just to not be miserable anymore as a miserable and lonely orphan. That's fine. We share that goal. I'm right there with him. But eventually, he morphed into self-deification. He morphed into idolatry, because his story really is one of idolatry, self-idolatry. And that is where the danger lies, and that was eventually where he fell into true evil.
And now, time for a word from our sponsors, us. In honor of Passion Sunday, what is a passion that you share with a Harry Potter character? Well, I think that my passion would be shared with Flitwick, and it would be choir music. I grew up in choir every year from when I was about 7 through grad school, definitely. And the thing about choir music was that I did not do sports. I did choir, I sometimes did theater, but the interesting thing about doing choir is that if you're in a choir that doesn't do a lot of solos, it teaches you how to be part of a group and work with others, and you have a certain amount of pride in being good at what you're doing, but it's never really about you. It's always about the group. And that felt like a very healthy way to form an ego in a kid for me. And the contrast between that and the kids who were on sports teams and were mostly focusing on trying to score points and like be the best on the team and stuff, that wasn't really what choir was about, because we didn't focus on solos. So it was all about making the group better. And I thought that was a really interesting contrast. And I think it's the kind of thing Flitwick would like too.
Nice. This will come as a shock to no one who knows me. But the passion that I think I shared a lot of passions with Hermione, and not even just passions, but like temperaments or character traits.
I think we both do. Yeah.
Especially growing up, one of the passions that I shared with Hermione was a passion to work against injustice. And I, in typical white kid fashion, did it in a lot of the same ways that Hermione did. I wasn't necessarily in relationship with the people that I wanted to like help or save or like do better for. And we see that most clearly with Hermione and Spew, S-P-E-W, that she's not in relationship with house elves. Most of them are like, we don't want this, stop, and like stop cleaning the Gryffindor common room, all of that stuff. And so I don't know, I did not go that far. I didn't ever found my own organizations, but I can definitely see the ways that I have changed in my engagement with injustice and like how I work against injustice and for justice. But it definitely at the roots was a lot of Hermione-ish work. And Hermione grows and does better too.
Yeah. And now we arrive at Maundy Thursday, which this year will fall on the 18th of April. The word Maundy comes from the Latin word for commandment. This is Commandment Thursday, when Jesus, during the Last Supper with the disciples, commands them and us to love one another as Jesus loves us. This day has a strong connection to the Jewish holy day of Passover. Just a note for those helping to plan their Maundy Thursday congregational activities. A play of the Last Supper is a common element, and that's fine. But if the idea of a Christian Seder meal comes up, we would generally encourage you not to do that. First, there are many articles you can find online written by Jewish people specifically asking Christians not to co-opt one of their most important holy days. And if that weren't enough, second, the Seder meal as celebrated now by Jewish people is not what Jesus and the disciples would have actually been doing at the Last Supper.
Traditions change over years and millennia.
Especially when it's been 2,000 years, yes. The one option to have a Seder meal with Christians on Maundy Thursday that we probably could go so far as to say, yeah, you could do that, would be if there are going to be actual Jewish people there, leading things, in charge of it. Like if you go as a group to a Jewish Seder meal, because you've been invited, or if a rabbi or a Jewish family come to your church and lead a Seder meal, so that it's not a Christian Seder meal, it is a Jewish Seder with Christians present. Christians are welcome to attend Seder meals if they're invited, but creating your own, because of the nature of the day, is, frankly, pretty rude.
And anti-Semitic.
Yeah. The closest comparison that I could make for what that would feel like, that a Christian could understand, would be if another religion created their own way of marking Good Friday and explaining what happened on that day from their perspective, in a frankly condescending way.
Mm-hmm. Or, for example, if any of, like, the centaurs or the witches or whoever co-opted a magical world tradition, or like Muggles decided, oh, we're going to celebrate the end of the Battle of Hogwarts, which like they wouldn't know about, but like those sorts of things where
it doesn't belong to them.
Yeah, it really doesn't belong and doesn't make sense.
And trying to experience another culture when you're trying to experience their celebration or their joy, that's one thing. When you're trying to understand another culture and you immediately jump to one of their tragedies, that's a very different thing indeed. So it's like if you're a Christian and you have someone who's staying with you who's another religion, you might invite them to come to Easter Sunday services, because Easter Sunday services are fun and it's an interesting cultural experience. You probably wouldn't invite them to a Good Friday service, because that's A, just depressing, and B, it's such a deep mourning period for Christians. We don't tend to share that outside of our group. That's when we're trying to share who we are as a religion, we usually do that through our celebrations first, and only through our tragedies once a person is maybe interested in joining us.
I don't know that I agree with that part. But I do think that if you were not Christian and you were visiting me on Good Friday, I think the thing here is that it would be like, for Good Friday, you saying, like, if you're not a Christian, you saying, hey, I'm going to lead a Good Friday worship for you.
Yeah!
Right?
Yeah.
That's what
exactly
a Christian Seder is.
This also, the other comparison I would make is that this is reminding me very strongly of a conversation I had many years ago about whether or not Christians should participate in the Ramadan fast as a way of standing in solidarity with Muslims. Mm-hmm. And the idea that several Muslim people in college brought up to me was that if you're going to join us at Eid, join us in celebration, join us in joy. Joining us in asceticism and in mourning and an acknowledgement of, well, I mean, we'd call it sin. Ramadan is not an exact parallel for Lent, but there are similarities. Mm-hmm. That's more difficult, and that requires a much deeper level of relationship. Mm-hmm. Really.
Yeah, we can hold space for Muslims as they...
Yeah, like if you're Christian and you have a Muslim friend, don't eat in front of them when they can't eat in Ramadan. That's just being friendly. You know, come on.
Yeah. But I've participated in Eid celebrations, and those are really lovely, and it is a good way to...
But even that, you only participate when you're invited.
Right, yeah.
So, moving on. Our first text for Maundy Thursday is from Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 through 4 and 11 through 14, although some people also include verses 5 through 10. God instructs the Israelites to prepare for the first Passover in Egypt, which will mark the beginning of the year for them in the future.
So one of the themes that I noticed was the Passover as a New Year's feast, right? That this is going to mark the beginning of the year from now on. And thinking about how different the feeling of Passover is when it's a new year, because they will be fleeing from slavery because God is enacting a plague that will kill all of these firstborns, and that they're rushed and have to go right away, compared to like the new school year feast in Harry Potter, which is everybody's finally arrived and like letting off a load of like all of the chaos of the train and
Right.
and feasting, because they've been eating, sweets for the whole day.
Right. Let's have some actual food, shall we?
Mm-hmm.
It's time for a sandwich. So in verse 1, we hear that God is speaking to both Moses and Aaron. And let's remember that the reason for that is because Moses insisted that he needed help, and God said that was fine. Mm-hmm. Needing help is okay. Moses and Aaron remind me, in a way, of Harry and Hermione. Moses and Harry as the face of the people, sort of. And the one with the relationships to the powerful, and Aaron and Hermione as the, I wouldn't say mouthpieces, but definitely the confidants and the advisors and mm-hmm. the backup, kind of.
Mm-hmm. And kind of the mouthpiece when it comes to forming the DA. I think Hermione
they both are good at helping, both Hermione and Aaron are good at helping Harry and Moses at figuring out what to say and how to say it. Mm-hmm. That's kind of their job. And so if you're going to complete the trio, this kind of leaves Ron as Miriam. And I was thinking about it, and the more I thought about it, the more I liked that comparison. Miriam celebrated and danced, and at one point, unfortunately, was also struck with leprosy because of Moses and Aaron's sins. And Ron is always ready and willing to embrace the good moments when they happen, which frankly is what a life of poverty will teach you. Mm-hmm. When the good moments come, enjoy them, because who knows how long it will be until they happen next. Mm-hmm. But also, at various times, suffers because of his connection to Harry, such as, for example, drinking Romilda Vane's love potion, mm-hmm. And many other examples as well.
Yeah, that's a really good comparison for the trio. I hadn't thought about it in those combinations. When we're talking specifically about the blood on the doorposts and the lintel of the houses and the markers, right, the ways that the blood of the lambs makes it easy to know who not to kill. I was thinking about the Battle of Hogwarts, and that the Death Eaters all have like masks and the dark mark, so they have ways to know not to kill each other. But for the kids who maybe want to switch sides, like Draco, right, who sneaks back through so that he can help the Death Eaters, there is no marker that he can really show to be like, hey, no, I'm on your side. And so we get the encounter between him and the Death Eater, where the Death Eater's like ready to kill him, and he's like, no, I'm on your side. And it's like, maybe you really shouldn't have come back and snuck back through to try to do this, because clearly you have no idea. Like, they're not going to have pity on you.
No. Is it explicit that you can only get the dark mark if you're of age? Do they make that
Well, and it's complicated, right? Because there's a good chance that Draco actually has the dark mark, but for whatever reason in Deathly Hallows, he's not using it to try to convince the Death Eaters.
Yeah. Panic will do a lot of things to you.
Mm-hmm.
In verse 11, last year we suggested that this meal was like the quick meal at the Hog's Head for the trio before the battle. And this year, I was also struck to think about James and Lily and Harry getting ready to go into hiding during the First World War, saying goodbye to Remus, Sirius, and Peter, and Harry, as the firstborn, being protected, not by the blood on the doorposts, but by a secret keeper.
Which totally
Which obviously
failed.
Wouldn't work out. Yes.
That's, you do keep bringing us back to this. It's so sad.
It's Holy Week. We're not supposed to be talking about happy stuff.
That's true. And, like, I love that you, like, went to this, like, last meal and, like, ready to go, and I'm, like, ready to move. Like, my connection to verse 11 was the part of being ready to go at a moment's notice, and Hermione's readiness, right? That she's had once Harry arrives at the burrow, she's already got all of her stuff and all of Ron's stuff packed in that purse, and then Harry's stuff goes in, and then the day of the wedding, she like sneaks in and grabs his backpack just in case something happens, which of course it does, but she is the one who is prepared and ready to go when it is time.
Which is such a Hermione-like thing to do.
Right. Yeah. And much less makes me want to cry, like the final meal with the Marauders.
You're welcome.
Our second reading for Maundy Thursday is 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 through 26. This is the institution of communion, the Last Supper, which proclaims Christ's death until Christ comes again. So the theme that stuck out to me was the embodied remembrance. I think partly because in the church where I worship right now, we're doing an embodied Lent. It's all about bodies. But thinking about the way that Jesus really is getting people into their bodies as he institutes communion, because it is. This is my body. This is my blood, the covenant of my blood. And thinking about Harry's remembrance of his parents via his scar before he finds out about Hogwarts and magic and the truth about how he got his scar, there's a point in the first book where it says that Harry always kind of liked his scar because it was the one connection. He had been told that he got it in the accident that killed his parents, and it was the one connection piece that he had to his parents, his embodied remembrance of them.
Especially considering the fact that we're pretty clear that he did not have baby photos of himself or pictures from his childhood.
Yep.
Yeah. In verse 23, when I read about Jesus instituting communion, I think that there's something to the idea that while Jesus is and can be cast as the Passover lamb, the sacrifice made to save the Israelites, he's also a firstborn. And he would fit in the same bracket as those who would be killed among the Egyptians to free the Israelites. And Harry, as the boy who lived, is firmly on the side against the Death Eaters, by all means. But depending on how you understand ritual blood purity in the wizarding world, he could be considered a half-blood. His mother was Muggle-born, so does that mean he's a half-blood or does that mean he's a pure-blood? It depends on who you talk to, I guess. Like Voldemort. And he would have been welcomed among the Death Eaters if he had wanted to be, which is why Draco offered friendship in the first book. At least initially. I kind of have to imagine that if Harry had taken Draco up on that he would have gotten killed by the Death Eaters eventually, because Voldemort still would have been worried he would kill him eventually, and it would be an excellent way for Voldemort to show his power.
Yeah.
And of course, Harry is also a firstborn. So I think there's some stuff you could play with there.
Draco, you mean? Draco is also...
Harry and Draco are both firstborns.
Yeah, you were talking about Harry being a firstborn, but you hadn't mentioned Draco being a firstborn yet.
I hadn't thought of that, but yes, that is true.
Okay, that's what I thought. Oh, that's what I thought you meant for... Okay.
Yes, both Draco and Harry are firstborns. And only children. Only children are awesome. Not that I'm biased or anything.
Just, a little kind of 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm a fan of a lot of the firstborns that I know. The only children, I mean. Whatever. I'm not an only child, and I'm not a firstborn. And I haven't had coffee. All these things are like combined in this one moment. Okay. Also thinking about the remembrance and the way that Jesus, right, we hear from Paul that Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me. And for those of us who are pastors or who receive communion in a mainline Protestant denomination, semi-regularly at least, that's one of the common phrases that will come up a lot of the time, not all of the time, but a lot of the time when people are presiding at communion is, do this in remembrance of me. And so then I was thinking about like Dumbledore's words encouraging remembrance of him, both like his help will always be given at Hogwarts to those who ask in the Chamber of Secrets when he's being like hauled off by Lucius Malfoy, but also like his words at the top of the astronomy tower to Harry, but then with Draco knowing that Harry is there and like the last words of how he will be remembered.
Right.
And he knows, right? Like that's part of it is like in those circumstances, Dumbledore knows that he's leaving Hogwarts for an unknown amount of time. But on the top of the astronomy tower, he knows that he's going to die. And he can be 99% sure it is going to be tonight.
In verse 25, the new covenant is referenced between God and humanity. And besides the Gospels, which this verse is referencing, the only place that the phrase new covenant is mentioned elsewhere in the Bible is Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34, when God says that God will write God's words on the hearts of God's people and forgive them and forget their sin. And this is what communion does and what it's about. And I wonder, in the Harry Potter books, on how many people's hearts the second Voldemort wrote peace and muggle-born equality and the dangers of pure-blood elitism, and how much forgiveness happened in the aftermath of all that between both sides.
Yeah, that's hard because there's a lot, right? Like a lot happened to divide them, and a lot of pain and violence and power.
And we only see the very beginning of that 11 years later. No, more than 11 years later in the epilogue. 19 years later in the epilogue. When Harry and Draco share a nod.
Mm-hmm. And that's just a nod, right? Like,
right. It's like him and Dudley having a handshake.
Mm-hmm.
And Draco and Harry are actually further apart than Harry and Dudley, because Harry and Dudley just had, a few years of childhood put between them, and Harry and Draco have this whole, house rivalry / Death Eater / all the rest of stuff between them.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. Although Cursed Child also does a lot to bring them back together, but that only kind of counts as Harry Potter. I also was thinking about in verse 26, right, that do this, and in this way you will proclaim the Lord's death until he comes, and wondering if that proclamation of death, right, and the ways that I think particularly as pastors we're aware of this in our work around with people who die and who are dying and funerals and burying people, right, that there is something about being willing to face and acknowledge death, or even to proclaim death, that keeps it from being so powerful or so controlling, maybe. Right, like Voldemort and the...
fear-based.
Yeah, Voldemort and the Death Eaters are afraid of death, and they deny death, and it completely controls all of their choices and what they're doing.
Yeah.
Like, yes, they're enacting terrible things against Muggleborns and Muggles, but a huge part of that is all out of fear of dying, and an unwillingness and an inability to actually confront that reality.
Yeah, there's a big conversation that has been going on for some time about how modern Western culture denies and fears death and tries to ignore it, and how there are some of us for whom that just can't happen. I had a very weird moment that was kind of surreal when I was, I think, about 26, so that would have been almost 10 years ago. Wow. When I realized that, unlike the entire rest of my age cohort, aside from people in my profession or similar professions, I was not violently uncomfortable when around a dead body. It genuinely, it was just not an issue for me. And that is deeply frickin' weird in our culture, especially for someone of that age group. So, that's a big part of it.
Mm-hmm. When I found in my own family, I'm a lot more likely to engage in conversation around death and spirituality connected to death as well than anyone else in my family.
I wouldn't quite say that about mine, because my family tends, and my in-laws and my extended family, there are a lot of conversations about, is that person dead yet? No, that person didn't die, right? No, it was their brother. Okay. That just happens all the time. I don't know why. But, yeah.
Well, I guess I'm also not talking about, the casual mentioning of death. I think that sometimes is more...
a deeper conversation.
Right, but a deeper conversation, and... Right, I'm the one who, sometimes we joke about, me being the designated funeral attendee. I show up at funerals for family members and for friends' families, and, right, I show up because I know how much it matters, and I know how important it is to be present in those spaces in particular.
And if people like us have a friend who is violently uncomfortable at funerals, but they have to go, sometimes we get asked to go with them just to help.
Yeah.
Our gospel reading for Maundy Thursday is from John 13, verses 1 through 17 and 31b through 35. Although some places may include the missing verses in that too. Jesus washes his disciples' feet, the duty of a slave, and commands them to love as he has loved them.
One of the most obvious themes for me in this passage is power in service. And we talked about it a little bit in the last text with Dumbledore and Harry, but this in particular, because it is Jesus literally doing what a slave is supposed to do.
Yeah.
I was wondering about what it would be like if Dumbledore became like a house elf, right? If he's...
That would be a very weird spell, but okay.
Yeah, but like if he's making the food and cleaning the clothes and like there's no...
Cleaning the toilets.
There's no way he does that.
No.
But that and the house elves and Dobby in particular they're never given the credit for their role. They're powerful, right? Like without them,
we don't even see the students thank them, really. Aside from like if you go down to the kitchens, you say thank you, but that's about it.
Because they're supposed to be invisible and
right.
But like without them, nothing functions. There have been a couple more recent conversations on Facebook about like folks who clean hotel rooms and the ways that hotels like try to suppress their hours by like if you have a like do not disturb thing up, it actually like they don't get paid. They get paid by how many rooms they clean, not by how many rooms total. And so if you have a do not disturb thing, you're actually like keeping them from making the money that they like maybe need and stuff. But the reality is also that without them, hotels don't function. There's no way a hotel can function without all of the people cleaning it. But
I don't know if you ever read them, or if you were a fan of the games. In the early 90s, there was a series of computer games that started with Myst and then moved on to Ribbon and several others. They were atmospheric puzzle games. I'm very fond of them. But eventually, one of the guys who wrote a lot of the games wrote a couple of novels related to them. And one of the cultures that was sort of briefly explored as a part of those novels had 2 sets of servant classes. And when these travelers first came upon this culture, they only saw one of them. And this first class of servants were, they worked for a living, but they seemed to be well treated. They were well dressed. They looked healthy. They were clearly eating enough, that kind of thing. They were doing okay. And they were also, it was explicitly mentioned that they were paid for their services. And they got to retire and have time off and all that kind of thing. It took weeks of living in that place to discover that there was a second servant class of people who existed, which were people from a different place, who were so carefully invisible the entire time that they had no idea that this second class existed. And those people were slaves, and they were beaten, and they were not fed properly, and they were killed, and they were treated terribly. And so that's kind of what I think of when I think about power in service. Dumbledore, if he stretched himself, I think could consider himself a servant to others in terms of that first class of servants. He was well-dressed and well-paid and well-fed for providing the service to the wizarding community of running Hogwarts. Yes, he certainly worked for other people, on behalf of other people, but he was well treated for it. I don't think Dumbledore has any idea, or has the emotional bandwidth to be able to, the emotional imagination to be able to consider what it would be like to be a house elf.
No.
To be that second class.
Well, and especially, that just made me think of Barty Crouch Jr., who is very willing to use Dobby and Harry's relationship with Dobby to make sure that Harry gets through all the tasks and the places he needs to be, but has no respect for Dobby whatsoever and no appreciation for what Dobby and the other house elves do.
Yeah. In verses 7 and 8, we get Jesus explaining that, no, really, Peter, I have to wash your feet. And then Peter's violent uncomfortableness with the idea of Jesus washing his feet. And this kind of reminds me, I know it's not a perfect comparison, but it kind of reminds me of Dumbledore being essentially okay, with Draco having to kill him, and forgiving him in advance. Only, of course, Peter's agreed to be washed, and then Draco refused to kill Dumbledore. It's not perfect, like I said. But Dumbledore was willing to lower himself to be killed. He's Supreme Mugwump, he's Headmaster, he's Master of the Elder Wand, he's Defeater of Grindelwald, he's got all this stuff, all this power. And he's willing to give all that and his life up, so that Draco, who isn't even one of his favorites, #failed pedagogy at Hogwarts, will not be killed by Voldemort. there are a lot of things about Dumbledore I don't like, but this is not one of them.
That is one of the powerful points of Dumbledore, is to say.
Yeah.
Or like, even when he's talking to Harry and Harry's like, no, let me spill my blood. And he's like, Harry, I am all of these things better than you and infinitely less valuable. And there's like more complexities when he says that to Harry compared to Draco. But that moment with Draco, I do think, is revealing to...
I love the fact that it's Draco that he sacrifices himself for and not Harry.
Yeah, right. It's revealing...
It's just so powerful.
...to who Dumbledore maybe wants himself to be. I was thinking about Dumbledore and Harry also in Half-Blood Prince in verse 16 when Jesus is talking about servants not being greater than their masters or messengers greater than the ones who sent them. And it reminded me of in Half-Blood Prince when Dumbledore is giving Harry all of the lessons and stuff. He consistently sends Harry messages through messengers, and sometimes it's Snape, just a verbal message, but a lot of times it's just a random student who has a scroll for Harry. And it's just kind of funny the way, like, why even would Dumbledore send the messages through students instead of an owl or talking with Harry directly? And so then that was just kind of this curiosity I had about the role of messengers. And sometimes they're necessary, right? Like when you're running from one place to another place because you don't have internet and stuff. But like, in Hogwarts, is that...
For the owls, I don't think they use owls within the school building. Like, that would get messy, wouldn't it?
True. Yeah, but there are a couple times, like, Hagrid will send Hedwig to Harry.
Okay.
But it still just happens at meals.
Right. Yeah, Dumbledore presumably can't wait that long.
I guess, but, like, you're not that important, Dumbledore.
Or maybe he's just not that good at planning ahead.
That's entirely possible and likely.
And then we reach verse 34, possibly one of my favorite verses in the Bible, possibly the favorite verse of a lot of people. Love one another. And now I want to imagine if Dumbledore, who was willing to let Draco kill him, had also said this to Draco, and through him to the rest of the wizarding world, to love one another as I have loved you, to love one another as Dumbledore loved Draco, to be willing to die in order to save each other, across all house and prejudicial lines.
Yeah. That would have been powerful. Yeah.
And would have been actually way too close of a Christian allegory for me to be happy with it if Rowling had actually done that. So I'm okay with her not doing it. Because I am also the person who, on finishing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe at the age of 9, threw the book across the room because I was so unhappy with Lewis having done such a straight allegory of the Passion story. But... the only book I've ever done that to, by the way. I've wanted to throw a few other books, but it's the only one I've actually thrown.
Interesting, because the rest of them you finished while you were older, and you were less...
I tried 2 of them. I have never actually finished any of the other Narnia books. Oh, the other books that I wanted to throw, you mean?
Yes, but also I've read all of the Narnia books, and they're... Anyway.
Yeah, no, I tried a couple of the other Narnia books, and I just couldn't... I wasn't that interested. I may have been too young for at least one of them. The other books that I wanted to throw across the room generally belonged to other people. So they were not mine to throw.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Going along with the, like, love one another, the next verse 35 says, Jesus says, by this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. And then I was thinking about it, and, like, how do people recognize Dumbledore's army or the Order of the Phoenix? By what are they known? They're not known for mutual love, because Snape and Sirius are a clear counter to that. They're not known for honesty, because Mundungus will take that away. But is there a common thread throughout everyone in Dumbledore's army or Order of the Phoenix?
I think we can kind of answer that by how we've been talking about them in the podcast. Because you'll notice that when we talk about Voldemort and the Death Eaters... their side, I mean, they have a name, Death Eaters, right? Whereas the side against, we always talk about Dumbledore's side as the side against Voldemort, the people against Voldemort, because there's Dumbledore's army, there's the Order of the Phoenix, there's the people who aren't technically involved but are still actually not Death Eaters, there's that kind of thing. They don't have even a name, really. Like in fandom, they often get called the Light versus the Dark. The people of the Light or the light side, which always makes me think of Star Wars.
Yeah.
But
and it's problematic.
But in the books or in the movies itself, they don't have a common name. It's just being against Voldemort. And frankly, I don't think all of them are really on the, like, in it for the same reasons either. Like, I don't think Mundungus is in this because he wants Muggleborns to be treated better.
He's in it because of Dumbledore. Loyalty to Dumbledore.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that really this is... I mean, when you think about it, the Voldemorts are a civil war, right? In the Wizarding world. And much like, say, the American Civil War, or any Civil War, the English Civil War too, there are people who are in it for different reasons. There are people who are in it for not great reasons. There are people who... And yet they wind up on the same side. You know?
Yeah. And I think, like, that's interesting because what I was thinking was, like, well, one of the things that they do have in common is that they're all different. Like, there's a lot more diversity in Dumbledore's army and Order of the Phoenix and the folks against Voldemort. But I don't know that everyone... Well, I know that not everyone agrees on that diversity, right? Like, there's still a lot of prejudice against werewolves, even though Remus is one of the people fighting against Voldemort. And
there are a few people who make comments about Muggleborns that are, oh, I'm so surprised that you're so intelligent.
Right, like Slughorn, yeah. And that is something that doesn't get addressed in the aftermath of the Voldemorts. Like, they don't actually go through and address all of that stuff. And so then in Cursed Child and other stuff, like, they haven't changed the systems of power and the structures that put everything problematically in place.
Yep. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we recap Harry Potter connections to the scripture readings for Good Friday.
This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Roloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and WordPress, all at HPATCHURCH, HP at Church. Or contact us at HPATCHURCH@gmail.com. This season, we're also working on putting our episodes on YouTube, where you can listen and see subtitles. So make sure you let your friends know and search for us.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. As the ancient Christian said, Pax vobiscum.